At the peak of Major League Baseball, Rafael Palmeiro once embodied near-perfect consistency, a name tied to numbers that only a few in history could reach. He recorded more than 3,000 hits, hit 569 home runs, and became one of the rare members of the 503,000 club, a milestone that demanded not only talent but also endurance stretched across decades. He was selected to the All-Star game 4 times, won 3 Gold Glove awards for his outstanding defense at first baseman, along with 2 Silver Slugger awards for being one of the best hitters at his position. Throughout a career that spanned teams like the Chicago Cubs, Texas Rangers, and Baltimore Orioles, he maintained an astonishing level of performance with many seasons of more than 30 home runs and 100 RBIs, a standard of the top hitters. But what set Palmeiro apart was not just individual peaks, but the ability to repeat them year after year. Without fanfare, without showmanship, only cold precision and relentless efficiency, making him one of the most dependable players the league had ever seen, a legend built on discipline rather than spotlight. But behind those nearly indisputable numbers lay a void that was hard to fill, a sense of loss that did not come from him not being good enough, but from everything he had achieved seemingly no longer being viewed in its original way. And that pain did not arrive in a loud moment, but spread gradually in silence, when the name once respected began to appear less in conversations, when the doors of fame no longer opened as they should have. And what made his story heavy was not only the shift in public perception, but the way he had to learn to live with it, without strong resistance, without trying to win everything back with words, but through quiet acceptance, continuing to move forward in a reality where the great past and the quiet present coexisted, where willpower was no longer about conquering the world, but about holding himself steady, about not being defined entirely by one moment, and about continuing to live with everything that remained, no matter how the world remembered him. Before moving on to the story behind those numbers, please hit like and subscribe to the channel as a way to acknowledge a journey that the world seems to have forgotten. And if you believe that a person should not be defined only by one moment, stay with us to explore the next part of this story. After everything the world had seen in him, few truly went back to where the story began, where there were no bright stadiums or numbers that amazed people, but only a child who left his homeland in silence, a memory that Rafael Palmeiro never recounted in a tragic way, but carried with him throughout his life. He was born in Havana, Cuba, at a time when everything around was no longer certain, and when his family decided to leave. It was not an easy choice, but a trade-off, a step forward without knowing what awaited behind. And when they set foot in the United States, the dream did not come with light, but with responsibility, because starting over from zero meant that every day was a proof, not to the world, but to his own existence. For a child, that was not interpreted in words, but felt through the smallest changes, through the way his parents worked more, through the unspoken worries, through the feeling that everything was fragile and could be lost if he did not try hard enough. And it was in that environment that Palmeiro grew up, with a very clear thought that failure was not a lesson, but something that was not allowed to happen. In the immigrant community, where every family was fighting to survive, the pressure did not come from comparison, but from the fear of falling behind. And for him, that turned into a life principle, a principle that needed no reminder but was always present in every decision, every action, every moment he chose to continue instead of stopping. His school years were not a time of exploration or experimentation, but a process of training where he learned to control himself, learned not to let emotions dominate, learned to do everything as precisely as possible. Because just one mistake, and the feeling of not being good enough would return, stronger and clearer, and would not allow him to forget where he came from. When baseball entered his life, it was not just a sport, but became a path, a way for him to turn invisible pressures into something concrete, where effort could be measured, where success could be seen, and where he could prove that all his family's sacrifices were not meaningless. But even as he progressed, even as he became better, the feeling of having to prove himself never disappeared. It only changed form. From proving he could play well to proving he could sustain it. From proving he deserved a chance to proving he deserved to stay. And that very transformation created a person who never allowed himself to stop, never satisfied with what he had achieved, because deep down, success was not an end point, but only a temporary pause before the pressure returned. What makes this story poignant is not that he had to work hard, but that he had no other choice, that from the beginning, his path was shaped by circumstances, by expectations, by a fear he could not name but always felt, a fear that if he did not keep moving forward, everything could disappear just as his homeland had once disappeared from his family's life, and therefore every step he took, every decision, every time he stood up after exhaustion, was not only for himself but also for something bigger, something invisible, but always present, making him the person the world later called consistent and reliable, yet failed to recognize that behind that consistency was an endless battle, a battle with his own fear, with the memories of those first days on American soil, and with the feeling that no matter how far he went, he still had to keep proving he deserved everything he had. And then as the years of youth gradually passed, what the world saw in Rafael Palmeiro was not an explosive personality or a star always seeking attention, but a person so quiet he was almost invisible. A silence not because he had nothing to say, but because he was used to keeping everything inside. In an environment where many players tried to assert themselves with words, with displayed confidence, Palmeiro chose a different path, where everything was shown through actions, through every swing, through every game, through every long season without loud moments, and that choice meant he never truly became the center of the spotlight. Not because he was not good enough, but because he never tried to be the one noticed. In the locker room, he was not the one who talked the most, not the one who led with words, but the one teammates could rely on without asking, a steady presence without showmanship, a person whose value was truly felt over time rather than through explosive moments. And that very silence, over time, was no longer just a choice, but became part of who he was. A way he faced the world, a way he protected himself from the pressures he had carried since childhood, because when he did not speak, he did not need to explain. When he did not show emotion, he did not need to face judgment. And when he did not become the center of attention, he could continue doing what he did best without distraction. But that silence also carried a price that few recognized, because when a person gets used to keeping everything inside, they gradually lose the ability to share, gradually lose the connections that others can easily create, and for Palmeiro, that meant he had to bear all the pressure himself, from external expectations to internal doubts, from disappointing days to moments when he felt he was not good enough, all kept inside, not spoken, not released, only transformed into a silent drive, an energy that made him keep moving forward without stopping. While many turned to emotion to motivate themselves, he turned to discipline, a near absolute form of discipline, where every day was repeated with the same intensity, the same focus, the same unchanging standard. And that repetition built a solid foundation for his career, but at the same time made his life more closed off, less colorful, with fewer outbursts that others could use to clearly perceive the real person inside. This meant that even when he achieved great success, when the numbers started to accumulate, when his name started appearing more in the stat sheets, he still did not become a symbol the way many others did, because he did not tell his own story. He did not create memorable images. He did not allow the world to see what was happening inside him. And therefore, the world only saw part of him. A very accurate part, but not complete. A part that reflected performance, but not the person. And perhaps that was exactly what made his career, no matter how great, still lack something people usually look for in legends. Not talent, not achievements, but connection. A connection he had never truly built, not because he did not want to, but because he did not know how, because from very early on, he had learned that emotions needed to be controlled, that pressure needed to be endured, and that the only way forward was not to stop and look back. And for that reason, every step he took in those years, though steady and strong, carried a loneliness no one could see, a loneliness that did not come from lacking people around him, but from no one truly being able to enter the world inside him, where all the fears, all the expectations, all the pressures still existed, unnamed, unshared, only transformed into perseverance, into long training sessions, into games where he did not allow himself to fail. And in that process, he built a career the world had to recognize, but also unintentionally built a distance between himself and the world. A distance that later, when everything changed, would become clearer than ever. And when he entered the professional world, where stadium lights could turn anyone into a star overnight, Rafael Palmeiro continued to choose a familiar path for himself. A path without noise, without showmanship, beginning with his early years with the Chicago Cubs, where he was not seen as an explosive talent, but as a player who needed time, needed patience, needed many games to prove he deserved to stay. Those early days had no big headlines in the press, no moments that made fans stand and applaud in amazement, but only regular appearances, timely hits, small but continuous contributions, and for many, that was not what created a legend, but for Palmeiro, that was the only way he knew to build his career, step by step, day by day, without skipping any detail, without allowing himself to deviate from the standard he had set since he was very young. When he moved to the Texas Rangers, everything began to change, not suddenly, but in a slow, steady rhythm, where his numbers gradually became more noticeable, where consecutive high-performance seasons began to accumulate into something bigger, but even then, he still did not become the focus of the media, still was not mentioned with the excitement that other players might receive, because he did not create stories off the field. He did not appear with controversial statements. He did not live in a way that the press could easily exploit, and therefore, even though he was doing what very few could do, he still stood in a position where the light did not shine directly on him. This was not, by chance, but the result of the way he chose to live and play, an approach in which performance was everything, where every game was seen as an opportunity to do better, where every season was a challenge to maintain the standard, and throughout that process, he almost completely eliminated factors unrelated to his work, not letting emotions dominate, not letting outside attention affect him, not letting uncontrollable things disrupt the rhythm he had built. In a world where many sought fame as part of their career, Palmeiro went in the opposite direction. He did not seek the spotlight, and the spotlight did not seek him. Instead, he sought perfection in the repeated things, in hits that seemed the same but required absolute focus, in training sessions no one saw, in moments when he had to face himself without cheers or recognition. And that focus created a very special image, a player coaches could trust, a person teams could rely on in important moments, not because he always created explosive moments, but because he rarely disappointed them. A reliability not always mentioned but always felt. In the locker room, he was not the one who talked a lot, not the one who created energy for the whole team, but the one whose presence brought a sense of stability, an assurance that things would be done the right way, that certain standards would not be broken, and over time, that became his greatest value. Not individual numbers, but the ability to sustain them. Not memorable moments, but the continuity that few could achieve. But that very thing also made his story different, because when a career is built without noise, without easy-to-tell stories, without memorable images, it is also easily overlooked when people look back, and while others are remembered for their personality, For iconic moments, Palmeiro was remembered, if at all, only through numbers. Accurate but cold numbers that carried no emotion, did not recount the journey, did not reflect what he had gone through to achieve them, and perhaps at that time this did not matter, because he was still playing, still moving forward, still accumulating small successes into a big picture. But later, when everything stopped, when the world began to look back and select what was memorable, that very silence, the very way he had built his career, became part of the tragedy, because he had done everything right, had followed the path of discipline and perseverance, had stayed away from things that could destroy him, but at the same time had not left the world a story strong enough to protect him when everything changed. And in that absence, what he had built, no matter how solid, became more fragile than he had ever thought. And then, as the years passed and the numbers began to accumulate into something undeniable, Rafael Palmeiro gradually became one of the most consistent players in Major League Baseball, not in one season, not in a few moments, but over many consecutive years, where each season he delivered almost the same level of performance, the same certainty, the same feeling that no matter what happened around him, he would still do his part. Seasons with more than 30 home runs and more than 100 RBIs were no longer exceptions but became routine, a standard he set for himself and then met time after time, to the point that it seemed normal in others' eyes, as if sustained excellence was no longer worth noticing, as if him doing his job well was simply expected. Meanwhile, around him were stars with more standout styles, names that drew media attention with strong personalities, with explosive moments, with easy-to-tell and easy-to-remember stories, people whose every time on the field could create something that made the whole world watch, and when placed next to them, Palmeiro was not the first one mentioned, not the face on the cover, not the figure that young fans wanted to imitate. This did not make him play worse, but it created an invisible gap between him and the recognition he deserved, a gap that could not be measured by numbers, but could be clearly felt in the way he was mentioned, in the way he was remembered, and sometimes in the way he was overlooked. His role on the team was not that of a symbol, but of a foundation, a person coaches knew they could count on, a person teammates understood would not let them down in important moments. But that very role was rarely honored because it lacked drama, did not create stories people wanted to retell, and therefore, even though he was there, even though he contributed every day and every game, his presence still did not create matching resonance. There were moments when, looking at the stat sheet, people realized he was nearing major milestones, that he was approaching numbers only legends could touch. But even then, the feeling around him did not change much. No media explosion, no feverish fan expectations, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if he was completing a task no one doubted, but no one really followed. And in all of that, perhaps what made his story poignant was not that he was not praised enough, but that he seemed to have accepted it from very early on, as if he understood that the path he chose would not bring glory, that what he built would be measured by performance rather than fame. And instead of fighting it, he continued to move forward, continued to play, continued to maintain the standard he had set for himself without needing external validation. This required a very special kind of willpower, a kind of perseverance that did not depend on encouragement, an ability to continue when no one was cheering, when no one was recording it. When everything seemed to happen in a loop, he had to maintain himself, and that very thing created a career that was technically almost perfect, but emotionally lacked the connection many others had. While other players could draw energy from fans, from the media, from attention, Palmeiro had to create motivation for himself, had to remind himself that what he was doing still mattered, that every game still counted, that every hit was still part of something bigger, even when no one stood up to applaud. And over time, that perseverance was not just a quality, but became an invisible burden. Because when a person keeps doing well without proportional recognition, They have to face a question that is not easy to answer: whether what they are doing is truly being seen, whether those efforts are truly being judged correctly, or whether it all exists only in numbers without emotion. For Palmeiro, the answer seemed less important than continuing, because he did not stop, did not change the way he played, did not try to stand out more. He just continued to be himself, continued to play the way he always had, and that very steadfastness, no matter how admirable, also made his story quieter, less retold. And gradually, as the years passed, as other names took the attention, he began to drift to the back of collective memory. Not because he was not great enough, but because he had built his greatness in a way the world was not used to remembering. And then, after many years of quietly accumulating achievements that few could sustain for long, Rafael Palmeiro finally reached the milestones that any player would dream of, numbers that spoke not only of talent, but also of a nearly uninterrupted journey of perseverance, when he surpassed 3,000 hits and hit the 500 home run mark, joining an extremely rare group in Major League Baseball history, where only the greatest names could stand together. Those numbers did not come in one explosive season, did not come from a short period of peak form, but were built year by year, game by game, swing by swing, repeated with astonishing precision, and that very consistency made him seen as one of the most reliable hitters the league had ever witnessed. A person who, when stepping onto the field, almost no one doubted would continue doing what he had always done, contributing, sustaining, and keeping his team in the best possible state. But the very way he achieved those things also made his story different, because he never turned those milestones into part of his personal image, never built a story around himself, never created moments for the media to exploit, never let emotion guide how he appeared before the public. And therefore, even though he was doing what should have been celebrated like a legend, he still did not become a symbol the way many others had, with no grand tribute campaigns, no strong protection from fans, no community ready to stand up and remind the world that they were witnessing something special. In an era where personal image became increasingly important, where the way a player told his story could determine how he was remembered, Palmeiro stood almost outside of it, not because he did not understand, but because he had never placed it above his work, had never seen being noticed as a necessary part of his career. And that very choice, though rooted in discipline and focus, unintentionally left him without a layer of protection that others had, a layer not in playing ability, but in how the public felt and connected with them. When a player had a strong story, a clear image, a loyal fan base, they were not judged only by numbers, but also by the emotion they created, and that could become a shield when things changed. But for Palmeiro, that shield barely existed, because he had never built it. He only had the numbers, the achievements, the clear evidence of his greatness, but lacked the emotional element that made others ready to protect him when needed. This was not an issue for most of his career, because when things went the right way, when he kept playing well, when the numbers kept rising, no one needed to protect him from anything. But within that very perfection lay a fragility he did not recognize, because a career built with almost no clear mistakes did not prepare him for the possibility that just one small deviation could change how everything was viewed. And when there was no strong enough personal story to balance it, when there was no deep enough emotional connection with the public, what remained was only the numbers. And numbers, no matter how great, could still be interpreted in many different ways. What makes this part of the story painful is not what he achieved, but that he achieved it all in a way that should have made him immortal in history, yet failed to create a solid enough foundation to protect himself when everything changed. And therefore, when looking back, people saw not only an excellent player, but also a person who had done everything right, had followed the path of discipline, had stayed away from clear mistakes, but failed to realize that perfection was not always enough, that in a world that judged by more than achievements, not building a story around oneself could also become a weakness. A gap that later, when trouble came, would have nothing to fill it. And that very gap, silent but profound, had existed beside him throughout his peak years, waiting for a moment he could not control, a moment when everything he had built would have to face the way the world chose to remember him. And right within that seemingly flawless perfection, another pressure began to form. Unclear, unspoken, but present in every game, every season, every number that Rafael Palmeiro continued to produce in Major League Baseball, because he was not playing in a normal period, but in a time when the entire league was changing, where old standards no longer seemed sufficient, where achievements became increasingly extraordinary to the point of nearly exceeding what people once thought were limits. It was an era where numbers soared, where home runs were no longer as rare as before, where players around him began achieving feats that made everyone ask questions, and in that context, maintaining performance was no longer simply playing well, but having to keep up with a pace that was getting faster and faster, a standard being pushed higher each year. For someone like Palmeiro, who had built his career on consistency and discipline, this was not just a physical challenge, but a profound psychological pressure, because he could not just rely on what he had done before, could not just continue as before and hope it would be enough, but had to constantly adjust, constantly adapt, constantly find ways to maintain his position in an environment where competition never stopped. But what made this pressure heavier was that it was never spoken clearly. No one stood in front of him and said the standard had changed. There was no specific moment marking the shift of the entire league. It all happened quietly, little by little, through numbers on the stat sheet, through games where he felt he had to do more to achieve the same result, through the feeling that if he slowed down, if he did not keep up, he could be left behind with no chance to return. In such an environment, the tension did not come from a single event, but accumulated over time, through each season when he had to wonder how much longer he could sustain this, through each game where he felt more clearly the pressure to not make mistakes, to keep proving he still deserved his current place, and because he was someone who did not share, did not show, all those feelings were not released, not spoken, only kept inside, becoming part of the drive, but also part of the burden. This created a state where, on the outside, everything still looked perfect. He still played well, still achieved impressive numbers, still was one of the most reliable players. But inside, the tension was gradually building, not because he was not good enough, but because the environment around him was changing in a way he could not control. And in that change, he had to find a way to survive by himself, without guidance, without protection, without any system to help him clearly understand what was happening. When looking back, it can be seen that this period laid the foundation for what came later, not through clear decisions, but through a prolonged psychological state, of feeling that everything was becoming harder, that the standard was exceeding reach, and that if he did not do enough, if he did not continue to achieve similar or better numbers, everything he had built could be questioned. But at that time, no one saw that. No one talked about that pressure, because on the outside everything was still working, games still took place, numbers were still recorded, and Palmeiro was still himself, a consistent, reliable player who created no problems, drew no attention, and for that reason, the pressure he faced became an invisible part of the story, a part not recorded, not mentioned, but with a profound influence on the way he thought, the way he felt, and the way he continued to move forward in a world that was gradually becoming different while he could not stop to adapt gently, because for him, stopping had never been an option. And perhaps that was exactly what made the tension keep increasing, not in one moment, but through each year, each season, each time he stepped onto the field with the same task, continuing to prove he was still good enough in a game where the standard of good enough was constantly changing. And then, after all those years of quietly enduring pressure that no one truly saw or named, Rafael Palmeiro stepped into a moment that the whole world was watching. a moment that did not take place on the field but in a cold room of the United States Congress, where the lights no longer shone on achievements but straight onto the person, where questions no longer revolved around games but around truth. And there, among a series of names suspected in the controversial era of Major League Baseball, he sat down not only as a player, but as a person who had to answer to the public about his own honor. There were no cheers, no cheering fans, no familiar feeling of the stadium, only tense silence and waiting eyes. And in that space, he did what he believed was necessary. He raised his head, looked straight ahead, and said a sentence that later would be repeated more than any number in his career. "I have never used steroids. Period." It was not a long sentence, with no complicated explanation, no evasions to avoid, but a firm affirmation, a way to put an end to all the doubts he thought he was facing, and in that moment, his image before the public was not that of an accused person, but of a person standing up to defend himself, to defend what he had built over many years, to defend the honor he believed he deserved. His eyes did not waver, his voice did not tremble. The gesture of pointing toward those asking questions carried a rare certainty, as if he was not only speaking to them, but speaking to the whole world, that he had nothing to hide, that everything he had achieved was the result of labor, of discipline, of the perseverance he had carried since the first days he set foot in the United States. For many who were watching, it was a powerful moment, a moment they felt they could trust. Because in a time when suspicion was spreading, when many names began to be questioned, he appeared with a clarity not everyone had. And that very clarity created trust, a feeling that there were people who still stood firm amid all that was changing. The press recorded that image, the public repeated that statement, and, for a period of time, it seemed he had succeeded in holding his position, not only as an excellent player, but as a representative of cleanliness in a phase full of doubt. But what made this moment profound was not only how the world saw him, but also how he saw himself. Because for a person used to keeping everything inside, standing before the public and saying something so decisive was not easy. It was an action that required absolute trust in himself, in what he had done, in the path he had chosen. And in that moment, perhaps he did not think about the consequences, did not think about what might happen later, but only thought about protecting what he believed was right, protecting his personal honor in the way he understood, directly, without avoidance, without hesitation. This also clearly reflected the person he had become, a person who did not try to tell his story with flowery words, but with clear statements. A person who believed that truth, when spoken decisively, would be enough to protect him from any doubt. And in that second, when he finished his sentence, when the space returned to silence, when the eyes were still directed toward him, there was a feeling that everything had been determined, that he had done what needed to be done, that his honor had been upheld, and that his story would continue in the direction he had built over so many years. For the public, it was a memorable moment, a moment they could hold on to amid a phase full of instability, a moment when they believed they were seeing the truth, and that very belief, in a short time, but enough to create influence, became part of his image, a part that later, when everything changed, would carry a weight no one could foresee. Because at that time, no one thought that statement would become the center of a bigger story. No one thought that the moment that seemed to have protected his honor was the point where everything began to change. And perhaps for that reason, when looking back, that moment was not simply an affirmation, but a marker, a boundary between what he had built and what was about to happen. The moment when he stood before the world with all his certainty, not knowing that the world was also preparing to look at him in a completely different way. And then, just in a period of time when no one was ready, everything started to change in a way that Rafael Palmeiro probably never imagined. When the test results were announced, positive for steroids, a brief piece of information, but enough to shake everything he had built over many years, Not because it was just a violation, but because it came right after the moment he had stood before Congress and affirmed the opposite. In a world where trust was already fragile, the contrast between his words and that result did not just create doubt, but created a shock. A feeling as if what had just been trusted suddenly was no longer certain, and the media, which always looked for stories with weight, immediately shifted direction, from recognizing him as one of the most consistent players in Major League Baseball to questioning his entire journey. The headlines started to change, no longer mentioning the numbers, no longer talking about perseverance, but revolving around one single word, a word enough to redefine everything in the eyes of the public. And from that moment, his name no longer stood alone, but always came with controversy, with doubt, with questions that not everyone waited for answers to. The public's reaction did not come in one single direction. There were people who felt disappointed. There were people who felt betrayed. There were people who tried to look for explanations. But what was clearest was the way they viewed him had changed, not gradually, but almost immediately, as if one door had just closed and another opened, taking him from the position of a symbol of stability to a position where every action, every past achievement, was placed under a different light. What made this moment so heavy was not just the test result itself, but the speed at which everything happened, because there was no transition period, no chance to adapt, only a sudden change in the way the world saw him, from trust to skepticism, from respect to debate, and in that process, what he had accumulated over the years began to be re-examined, not because they disappeared, but because their meaning no longer remained the same as before. For a person who was used to controlling himself, used to building everything systematically, witnessing this change happening beyond his control was probably a hard-to-accept experience, because unlike previous challenges, where he could respond with effort, with discipline, with performance on the field, this time, everything was no longer within what he could directly influence, and that created a feeling of helplessness that he had never had to face at such a level. From the outside, the shift in the way he was mentioned was clear, from a name placed in the list of the greatest players to a name tied to one of the biggest controversies of that era. And this shift not only affected the way others saw him, but also affected the way his story was told. When the parts that were previously seen as proof of greatness now were placed in a different context, a context where every number, every achievement had to go through a layer of doubt before being accepted. The pain lay in the fact that nothing in the past really changed. The hits still existed. The home runs were still recorded. But the way they were perceived was no longer the same as before, and that very change created a gap between the person he had once been in the eyes of the public and the person he became after this moment. A gap not easy to fill with any explanation. In the days after that, as the information continued to spread, as the debates became more intense, as opinions began to divide, one could imagine the feeling he had to face, not a noisy collapse with explosive reactions, but a slow but sure change in the atmosphere around, a difference in the way people looked at him, talked about him, and remembered him. From a person who caused no controversy, he became a figure that every time he was mentioned, brought along a discussion, an evaluation, a question without a clear answer, and this, over time, not only redefined his image, but also shaped the way history would remember him. Perhaps there was no specific moment he could point to and say that everything ended there, because the change did not happen like a fall, but like a shift. But when looking back, the day the test results were announced was the point where his name began to carry a different meaning, a meaning that he could not control, could not erase, and could not return to as before. And in all of that, the overarching feeling was not the noise, but a heaviness, a gradually clear realization that what he had built throughout his life would now always be seen through a different lens. A lens that no matter what he said or did, would always exist beside him, like an inseparable part of the story that the world had chosen to tell about him. And then, after the day when everything changed direction, What happened next was not a noisy storm, as many people still imagined about a collapse, but a long period of silence, a slow but clear shift in the way Rafael Palmeiro existed in the world that once belonged to him, when there were no longer headlines praising him, no longer conversations revolving around achievements, but instead a growing distance between him and what had previously been the center of his life. There were no long press conferences to explain, no media campaigns to regain his image, no statements confronting public opinion, only increasingly sparse appearances, quiet times avoiding the cameras, as if he understood that any words at this point would hardly change the way people had begun to perceive him, and in that silence, his story continued to be told by others, by the press, by the public, while he himself stood outside, not participating, not countering, not adding any other perspective. This was not giving up, but like a wordless choice, a way to face a reality he could not control, where every explanation could be interpreted in many directions, where every statement could become part of the debate he did not want to continue fueling. And so he chose silence. A silence not because there was nothing to say, but because he no longer believed that words could make any difference. Meanwhile, the relationships that had been attached to him throughout his career began to change, not through clear conflicts, but through gradual distancing. When phone calls became fewer, when invitations no longer appeared, when conversations in the locker room, which had once been a familiar part, no longer existed in his daily life, former teammates continued their careers, coaches continued to build teams, the league still operated with an unchanged rhythm, but his position in all of that gradually became faded, as if he was standing outside looking into a world where he had previously been an indispensable part. This feeling did not come immediately, but formed over time. Through each day he realized that he was no longer at the center of what had once defined him, that the habits, the schedules, the goals that had once occupied his entire life no longer existed in the old way, and in that emptiness, he had to find a way to redefine himself without the familiar anchors. What made this period heavy was not material loss or complete collapse, because his life did not fall apart in the way many people might imagine, but the change in the feeling of belonging, a feeling that he was no longer in the flow of the world where he had spent his entire life building his position, a feeling that what had once been the center was now only a memory. And while on the outside everything might look like a normal transition, inside it was a difficult adaptation process, when he had to learn to live without continuous validation from achievements, without games to prove himself, without numbers to measure his value. And this was especially difficult for a person who was used to defining himself through what he could do on the field. The silence he chose was not only a reaction to the media, but gradually became part of a new life, where he no longer tried to explain, no longer tried to change others' perceptions, but focused on existing in a reality that had changed. A reality where he had to accept that he could not go back as before, that what had happened would always be part of the story, and that the only way to continue was to learn to live with it. In that process, perhaps the hardest thing was not losing the attention, but losing the connection with a world he had once fully belonged to, a world where every day he had a role, had a clear purpose, and now, when that role no longer existed, when that purpose was no longer defined by games, he had to find a new meaning for himself, a new way of existing while still carrying everything that had happened. And precisely in that quiet transition, without noise, without dramatic moments, his career did not end with a clear fall, but with a gradual withdrawal, a fading from the center that no one could point to the exact time, but everyone could feel when looking back, a disappearance not because he was no longer himself, but because the world around him had changed the way it perceived him. And in that change, he could no longer hold the position he once had, not through direct deprivation, but through a growing distance he could not narrow whether he tried or not. And as the years passed after everything that had happened, When the rhythm of the league continued without the regular presence of Rafael Palmeiro, a question gradually became clearer than ever, a question that not only he but also those who followed baseball had to face, which was how his position in history would be defined. And the answer began to emerge through each voting season for the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, where numbers like his should have guaranteed an almost certain position, where players with similar achievements had been honored, had their names recorded, had been placed in a space that time could not erase. But for Palmeiro, that door did not open, not once, but repeated over many years, each time carrying the same result, the same wordless message that what he had done on the field, even though it still existed in the stat sheets, was still not enough to convince those who held the power to decide how history was written. The disappointment did not come as a single shock, but accumulated through each time, through each voting season when his name was mentioned and then fell below the required threshold, through each year when hope, no matter how small, had to face the reality that everything had not changed and perhaps would not change in the way he once thought. What made this period heavy was not only not being recognized, but the prolongation of that feeling when there was no definitive conclusion, no moment when everything was completely closed, but only a slow process in which the possibility of being honored gradually became more distant, as if time did not blur what had happened, but, on the contrary, made it more fixed in the way people perceived it. Meanwhile, his numbers were still there, unchanged, not lost, still standing firm in the history of Major League Baseball as undeniable evidence of an outstanding career. But the paradox lay in the fact that those very numbers were no longer heavy enough to take him to where they should have led. Because the way history was remembered was not only based on data, but also on trust, on emotion, on the way a person was perceived beyond what they had achieved. And in Palmeiro's case, the gap between those two things became clearer than ever. One side was nearly perfect achievements. The other side was the way he was remembered. Two realities existing in parallel, but never truly meeting. This created a very hard-to-describe feeling, a feeling of standing outside the door that should have belonged to him, clearly seeing what was inside, knowing he had enough qualifications to step in, but still unable to cross that threshold, not because of lack of ability, but because other factors had shaped the way that door was opened. Over time, this feeling no longer carried the urgency of the early days, but became deeper, because it did not disappear but only settled down, becoming part of the reality he had to accept, a reality in which he was both one of the players with the most impressive achievements and a person not honored in the way those achievements usually brought. And this very parallel existence created one of the most painful aspects of the story. When a person could look back at his career and see everything he had done, all the efforts, all the years devoted to the game, but at the same time clearly see that the way the world remembered those things did not fully reflect what he had experienced. No new collapse occurred at this stage. No major incident changed the situation. Only the repetition of the same result. The same rejection expressed through ballot numbers. The same gap not narrowed. And in that repetition, there was a quiet fatigue. A gradual acceptance that there were things in life that could not be fixed, could not be reversed, could not be reset in the way we wanted. But even in that acceptance, there was still a part of him, perhaps the part that had been formed from the early years, from the pressure to prove himself, from the belief that effort would lead to results, that continued to exist, that still held on to the thought that what he had done had value, that whether recognized or not, the truth about his career could not be completely erased. And perhaps that very thing, even though it did not bring official honor, was what helped him continue to move forward, continue to live with a story that not everyone fully understood, but still existed, still had meaning, even when it was not recognized in the way he once thought was certain. And when the doors of fame gradually closed in a way he could not control, Rafael Palmeiro's life did not stop, but shifted to a different space, where there were no stat sheets, no ballots, no public evaluations, but only the closest relationships remained: family, wife, and sons, people who did not see him through the lens of the media or history, but through what he was present for every day. In the role of a father, he was no longer a name mentioned in debates, but the person standing by their side, the guide, the listener. And precisely in that space, his story carried a different meaning, no longer revolving around whether he was recognized or not, but revolving around preserving what remained and ensuring that his loved ones did not have to bear what he had experienced. But even in that quietness, the past did not completely disappear, because fame, although changed, still existed in a different form. And what made this period special was not only that he had to live with the way the world perceived him, but that his children also had to face it in their own way, when their father's name appeared in not simple stories, when what was once pride could become the source of questions, glances, comments that were not always easy. For a father, nothing was heavier than realizing that his choices, even made under certain circumstances, could affect the way his children were perceived, and perhaps that very thing made Palmeiro more cautious, more private. Not because he wanted to avoid, but because he wanted to protect, wanted to keep his family away from the pressures the media could create. He did not try to bring his family out in public to retell his story, did not turn personal relationships into part of a public image, but chose to keep them in a private space, where they could exist without being affected by what happened outside. This did not mean the difficulties disappeared, but only that the way he faced them changed, from trying to prove himself to the world to focusing on what he could control: the evenings with family, conversations not related to baseball, the moments when he did not need to be anyone else but himself. In that process, his role with his sons became clearer, not as a perfect role model without flaws, but as a person who had gone through both success and controversy. A person who could talk about what had happened not from the perspective of justification, but from the perspective of experience, of understanding that life did not always go as we expected, and that the value of a person lay not only in what they achieved, but also in the way they continued to live after what had happened. This created a different kind of connection between him and his children, a connection not based on perfection, but on truthfulness, where he did not need to hide the past, but also did not let it define his entire person, where he could show his children that no matter how the world perceived it, there were still unchanging values, presence, care, responsibility, and family affection. Over time, these things gradually became the most important anchors, not because they replaced what he had lost, but because they brought a different meaning, a way to look back at life not only through the lens of success or failure, but through what remained and what could continue to be built. And in that shift, there was a calmness he had not had before. Not forgetting, but acceptance, a state in which the past still existed but no longer completely dominated the present, where he could look at his sons and see something not affected by the controversies, something that continued to grow, continued to live, continued to have meaning. Perhaps this very thing helped him maintain balance, not by regaining what had been lost, but by realizing that not everything in life could be measured by external recognition, that there were values that did not appear on stat sheets, were not recorded in halls of fame, but still had their own weight. And for Palmeiro, in this period, family was exactly that, a place without judgment, without unanswered questions, only the presence of a person who had been through so much and still continued to be there, not to prove anything, but to live, to preserve, and to ensure that what was truly important was not swept away with the changes he could not control. And in the calmness that family brought, Rafael Palmeiro entered another stage of life, where the hardest thing was no longer competing or maintaining form, but existing in a world where he no longer held the old role, a world where his story had been shaped in its own way, and what was notable was that he did not choose to confront it with long debates, did not appear frequently to defend himself in public, did not try to build a campaign to completely change everyone's perception. Instead, he seemed to accept that there were things that could not be resolved by words, that each statement could open up more controversies he no longer wanted to participate in. And so he chose a different path, less noisy, more private, where he did not need to constantly repeat his past to explain or justify, but focused on living in the present in his own way. Life after leaving the field was no longer tied to game schedules, to constant travel, to the pressure of every match, but shifted to a slower rhythm, less spotlight, less attention, and in that rhythm, he did not try to recreate his image as before, did not try to become a figure who frequently appeared in the media, but kept a certain distance, as if he understood that too much presence could pull him back into the stories he had chosen not to continue pursuing. This did not mean he completely withdrew from the baseball world, because there were still times he appeared. There were still efforts to return in some way, but those efforts did not create big impact, did not bring him back to the central position as before, and over time, that became clearer, that his role in the current context had changed, that no matter how hard he tried, some things could not return as before. For many people, this could be another failure, but for Palmeiro, it seemed to become part of the acceptance process, an understanding that life did not always allow us to fix everything, that there were stages that ended without the opportunity to start again in a similar way, and in that understanding, he no longer tried to resist reality, but learned to exist within it. This was shown through the way he lived more quietly, appeared less, not because he had nothing to say, but because he no longer felt the need to speak, because what was important to him at this point was not being fully understood, but maintaining a stable life, keeping important relationships, and continuing to move forward without being pulled back by what had happened. This acceptance did not come immediately, but was the result of time, of going through different stages, from the days when everything was still new and heavy, to the times when he began to look back at his life in a different way, not only through what had been lost, but through what still remained. And in that process he gradually found a new position, not the position he once had, but a position where he could exist without having to constantly prove anything. Perhaps what made this period special was not in what he did, but in what he did not do, not debating, not reacting strongly, not trying to change everything by confronting, but choosing a quieter path, where he could keep the important parts of his life without being drawn into the vortices he no longer controlled. And in that quietness, there was a different kind of strength. Not the strength to win or conquer, but the strength to continue, to accept, to live with an imperfect story without letting it break his entire person. A strength not easy to recognize from the outside, but what helped him maintain balance in a life that had gone through so many changes. When looking back, one could see that not participating in long debates, not trying to completely change the public's perception, was not giving up, but a conscious choice, a way for him to control the rest of his life in the way he could. And although that choice did not bring him back to the old position, it brought him a different kind of freedom. Freedom from having to constantly prove. Freedom from having to respond to every opinion. Freedom to exist as a person rather than a story told by others. And perhaps precisely in that freedom, he had found a way to continue, not as an honored legend, but as a person living with everything that had happened, not avoiding, not denying, but also not letting it define his entire life. And in the stillness he had chosen for himself, Rafael Palmeiro's life did not collapse in the way many people might imagine when thinking about major incidents. There was no complete breakdown, no material losses that made everything empty, but on the contrary, on the surface everything seemed still stable. Family was still there, the passing days still had their own order. Mornings still began, evenings still ended in familiarity, and that very normality created a very special feeling. a feeling that life still continued, but no longer the same as before. What changed was not what could be seen immediately, but the way he perceived himself in everything that had happened. A slow process in which he had to face the question about himself not only through what he had achieved, but through what had happened after that, through the way the world perceived him, and through the way he accepted or did not accept those things. Before, he himself could be clearly defined through his role on the baseball field, through the numbers, through the stability he maintained for many years. But when those things were no longer the center, he had to find a different way to understand himself, a way not entirely based on achievements, but based on existence, on the values he still held, and on the way he continued to live with what had happened, without letting them completely destroy his sense of self. This did not come easily, because memories did not disappear. What had happened still existed in the way he was mentioned, in the stories others told, in the moments he realized that his past always came with the present. But over time, he gradually learned the way not to let those things occupy all the space, learned to let them exist without completely overshadowing what remained. And that very process created a profound change. Not the disappearance of the past, but a change in the relationship between him and that past. His personal life, in all of this, became a stable foundation, not because it replaced what had been lost, but because it brought an anchor he could rely on. A place where he did not need to be a symbol, did not need to explain, did not need to face continuous evaluations, but only needed to be present as a person, a father, a husband, a part of a family whose value was not measured by what happened outside. However, this stability did not mean everything returned as before, because there was a clear difference between not losing everything and still keeping everything as before. And for Palmeiro, his life lay between those two states, not falling into complete collapse, but also unable to return to the time when everything was intact. A state he had to learn to accept as part of reality. In this process, the silence he had chosen earlier was not only a reaction, but became a long-term state, a way of existing. He gradually became familiar with, where he no longer felt the need to fill the emptiness with words, no longer tried to explain everything to the world, but accepted that there were stories that would be told in many different ways, and he could not control all of them. This silence was not avoidance, but a form of balance, a way to keep his life from being drawn into the loops of the past, a way to continue moving forward without stopping at every comment or every perception from the outside. And in that silence, there was something very real, an acceptance that life did not always allow us to keep the image we had built, that there would be changes whether we wanted them or not, and that the way we lived with those changes was what defined the rest of the journey. For Palmeiro, that journey was no longer about conquering new milestones, but about holding on to what remained, finding meaning in the things not affected by what had happened, and continuing to live with an imperfect story but still belonging to him, a story he did not need to completely fix, but could learn to accept and carry as a part of the person he had become. And then, when all the noise had settled, when the controversies no longer flared up with the previous intensity but still quietly existed in the way people mentioned him, Rafael Palmeiro's story gradually entered a harder-to-define region, where there was no longer a clear boundary between glory and controversy, where what he had achieved and what had happened coexisted in the same memory, neither completely overshadowing the other, but neither disappearing. Looking back at his career, one could not deny that the numbers still stood there as solid milestones in the history of Major League Baseball: more than 3,000 hits, more than 500 home runs, many seasons with consistent performance that very few could maintain. Years of non-stop dedication, all creating a journey that, if only looking at achievements, there was almost nothing to doubt, a career that many others would be honored as a symbol. But at the same time, one could not ignore the reality that his story was not told only by those numbers, but always came with another layer of meaning. A layer of meaning that made the way people perceived him more complex, harder to unify, when each person could choose a different point to start the story, some starting from achievements, some starting from the incident, and that very difference made his image never completely clear. This raised a question that was not easy to answer, not only for those who followed baseball but for himself as well. How history should remember a person like that, should focus on what they had achieved, or on what had changed the way people looked at them. And when those two things did not match, when they existed in parallel but brought different emotions, could there be a single answer? For Palmeiro, that question was not only theoretical, but part of the reality he had to live with. When he realized that he was both a person with respectable achievements and a controversial figure, a person not everyone perceived in the same way, and this did not change over time, but only became clearer as the gap between past and present grew larger. However, in all that uncertainty, there was one thing that could not be completely erased, which was the value of the journey he had gone through, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, because of the years he had devoted to the game, because of the efforts he had put in, because of the way he had built his career from the smallest things. All of that still existed, not completely dependent on the way it was perceived, and that very thing created another layer of meaning, a layer of meaning not in titles or official recognition, but in the reality that a person had lived, had worked, had achieved things that not everyone could do. When looking at him in the present, no longer the image of a player on the baseball field, no longer the center of debates, but a person continuing his life in quietness, carrying everything that had happened without trying to erase or replace it. One could see that his story did not end with a clear conclusion, but opened in many different directions, depending on the way each person chose to perceive it. There might be people who remembered him for the controversies. There might be people who looked at the numbers and saw a legend, and there might also be people standing in the middle, realizing that both were part of the same person, a person not perfect, but could not be reduced to a single definition. And perhaps precisely in that lack of clarity, in the absence of a simple answer, Palmeiro's story became more thought-provoking, not because it provided a specific lesson, but because it reflected a reality that life was not always remembered in the way we wanted, that there were things we could not control, and that the way we continued to live after all was the part we could hold on to. For him, that remaining part was not changing the way the world perceived him, but continuing to exist with everything that had happened, not avoiding, not denying, but also not letting it define his entire person, a state that might not bring complete liberation, but enough for him to continue moving forward, enough for him to keep what still had meaning, and enough for his story, no matter how it was told, to still exist as a part of history, not perfect, not complete, but impossible to erase. The story of Rafael Palmeiro leaves a very different bittersweet feeling, not an explosive pain, but a pain that lingers in silence. When a person who had reached the peak with more than 3,000 hits and 500 home runs was gradually pushed to the edge of Major League Baseball's memory just because of one moment that changed the way the world saw him. What made this story heartbreaking was not only the positive test result, but the clear contrast with the image he had built before, especially the moment he stood before Congress and affirmed he was clean, a statement carrying belief, but later becoming the center of skepticism, making his entire journey of perseverance, discipline, and stability placed under a different perspective. And then, instead of a noisy collapse, we witnessed a quiet withdrawal, where he did not argue, did not react strongly, but chose to live privately, focusing on family, on the role of a father, keeping his children away from media pressure, a choice that showed resilience in a very human way. This both made people regretful and made people respect him. because he did not deny the past but also did not let it destroy the rest of his life. For American society, this story carries a very practical lesson that success, no matter how great, can become fragile if trust is damaged. But at the same time, the value of a person cannot be completely erased just by one mistake. And the way we face mistakes, the way we continue to live, continue to be a father, be a person, sometimes is even more important than the initial success. In a culture that values achievements and fame, Palmeiro's story reminds us that we need to perceive people more comprehensively, not only through their worst moment, but through the long journey they have gone through. Because if not, we not only lose fairness, but also lose the ability to understand, which is the foundation for a more mature and humane society. If Rafael Palmeiro's story makes you reflect, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to appreciate a journey that not everyone fully understands. Thank you for following until the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that the world often misses.